If any of us was to discern just a general ethos of the season of Advent, and you could probably come up with a few different themes and ideas, but something that just screams, at least in my mind, and has captivated my attention, and especially this week, it's a general ethos of the eagerness and zeal with which we seek the Lord with the whole of our lives. You really can latch on to that theme in almost any of the texts of the Mass that we've heard so far. The hymn, eagerly we run, the entrance antiphon, the collect of today's Mass, this idea of hastening toward the Lord, and that no human undertaking would hinder us. There's this obsession, if you will, within the church, within this season especially, to be consumed with what it is in the Christian life to seek Jesus. To seek Jesus who has already come in time as an infant and redeemed us. To seek Jesus who will return and to be ready for that day or for our death. And to seek Jesus in the everyday circumstances of our lives and to receive his coming as it is, contemporarily present, especially within the sacraments. Now, a theme within my own life that's been relatively prominent, I try not to share too much about my own life sometimes, but there's dangers there. But something I've noticed in myself and something I've noticed over time, the ease with which fallen humanity, meaning all of us after the fall, after original sin, wounded as we are, even after baptism with the effects of original sin, the tendency that we have to really be intensely focused upon ourselves. This is one of the greatest spiritual dangers. It's really just a corollary of the great sin of pride. The propensity to turn in, to try to discern and see really everything in our lives is about us, to take things really personally, to be upset about little things. Even within the spiritual life, to really kind of start with me, my experience. What am I doing? What am I feeling like today? How is my prayer going? How do I feel about my prayer? This kind of almost obsession that we have with ourselves. So you kind of can relate these two obsessions then, the obsession of ourselves with ourselves and the obsession of the church in this season with being intensely focused and seeking and running and hastening toward the Lord. Okay, now a little bit of a delving into some of what we are doing here at the parish by way of how what I just shared informs some things. When I first, in a very kind of fearful way, heard God's voice that I might need to follow him and be a priest, I wasn't thrilled. My perception of priests bristled a little bit with my own temperament, okay? Stay with me. I tend to be pretty shy. I'm not a performer. I hated being in front of people growing up. I hated the idea of being looked at, being the center of attention. That was not something I enjoyed. And there was something about just the way that you kind of enter into a relationship with priests, especially the experience of Sunday Mass, my growing up, it felt kind of like a show. You've got the audience out here, and you've got the priest, the performer up here, and he's doing things, and we're constantly looking at each other, and we're interacting, and hopefully smiling, and maybe whatever it might be. It really bristled with that. I'm not a performer. I also, and I don't feel too embarrassed admitting this, considering it doesn't flare up very much, but I grew up with a debilitating stutter, so that was the other fearful thing. I literally couldn't speak fluently. I would struggle getting even the most, I'd just struggle getting any words out. Okay, So grappling with that was definitely a challenge. And as I went to the seminary and began all of that formation, I found the Lord very providential in helping me to receive something of what I guess you could just simply call a compromise within priestly ministry. Because as I learned more, as I read more, as I prayed more, it became pretty clear that yes, there is something within the celebration of the church's sacred liturgy that does admit to this exchange right now. That I'm in front, I'm talking, you're listening, we're interacting in some way. There is some of that, and I was going to have to get over myself a little bit and challenge my own temperament and be willing to be in front of people, and that's fine, and that's good, and we should all be eager to allow the Lord to stretch us. But there was something else that I learned too, and I'm indebted in ways that I can't even begin to articulate to the mature thought of some champions of the Catholic faith. But I want to identify, kind of by way of emphasis or by way of primary concern, Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI. I read a book pretty early on in seminary. He had penned, it was something of a synthesis of a lot of things that he had previously written about the sacred liturgy. It was a tip of the hat, actually, to one of his heroes, Romano Guardini. He wrote a book called The Spirit of the Liturgy. And this was the first time I had ever encountered a really robust articulating of the ancient practice from the very beginning of the Christian faith, of the most sublime moments of the celebration of the liturgy, the moment where Jesus comes to us, the moment of the Eucharistic prayer, the moment of profound reverence that we have before Almighty God, who makes himself present to us and wraps us into the Paschal mystery and brings us on our knees to Calvary. I was able to receive from his mature thought this truth that despite what I had previously experienced, and I was born in the 1980s, the idea of a priest facing the people during those most sacred moments of the Mass was an innovation. It was something new. And maybe it had really, really good motivations. Maybe there was really a motivation to try to, captivate people's attention more, focus on the rituals and the symbols and some of the actions that would be better seen. That's a good admission, at least, to get out there. But that was the part of the Mass that particularly freaked me out. That during those sacred parts of the Mass, there would still be this weird, exchange where I'm somebody who's to be entertaining or performing or entering into some kind of human dynamic with all of the other human beings in the church. And Ratzinger articulated that from the very beginning of the Christian faith, there was an obsession, almost. You could call this the obsession homily. An obsession within Christian worship of the Eastern direction. And stay with me. We got a taste of that actually in the first reading from the prophet Baruch. Jerusalem, stand up on the heights, turn toward the east and see your children. It was Ratzinger's familiarity with the scriptures, with the tradition of the church, with all of the texts of the liturgy that he had encountered for his whole life in education and ministry as a priest that led him to articulate this fundamental reality that it was really from ancient times. And he's done the work, that this was the fundamental orientation of the Christian people, hastening toward the Lord together. That the personality of the priest, the humanity of the priest, is to, if you will, fade away during those parts of the Mass where we invite the Lord to act directly in the sacrament of the Eucharist. That there's actually a fundamental unity then communicated between all of the people of the church and the priest when the host is elevated. And that's where the attention is for all of us. Not my face looking at your face or your eyes looking at mine, but this fundamental reality where we're all beholding together the Lord Jesus. By way of an illustration, this is very brief. He especially zeroed in on the tradition in Rome. If you're familiar with Rome, there's a lot of hills, traditionally 7, and there's a few other hills outlying Rome. One of those outlying hills is the Vatican Hill. So that's actually why we get the name of the Vatican city-state. And that was where St. Peter was buried, and that was where very early on in Christianity there was this impetus to build a magnificent church right over the grave of St. Peter. And by the way, some excavations that happened during World War II basically confirm, as much as we can possibly confirm, that St. Peter is actually there. There was a lot of archaeological research there. It was stunning. You can take a tour, by the way, underneath St. Peter's Basilica. But the challenge here, and this is by way of illustration, is they had to excavate a good chunk of the Vatican Hill to be able to build the church. The problem, though, and how this bristled a little bit with how the Christian people had learned to pray already, was that the lowest part of the hill was also the eastern side of the hill, meaning that they were either going to have to basically knock down the whole hill so as to be able to orient the church to face east, or they would just have to have a compromise, and they would have to excavate as much of the hill as was reasonable, and that's the path they chose, and put the church up, and it would face west. Now, here's what Ratzinger shared in his book. Very interestingly, even though we had an altar on the western side of the church and the people on the eastern side of the church, and this was something of an innovation at the time, during the Eucharistic prayer, and this seems crazy to our modern sensibilities, this seems insane, but stay with me. During the Eucharistic prayer, there would be a call, and it would be all of you, because we didn't have pews back then, who would have turned around and faced east with the priest. Very, very curious, and very foreign to our modern sensibilities. So important was this liturgical symbol of praying with the whole of creation, praying with the cosmos, the symbol of the rising sun, inaugurating new life in Jesus. So important was that was what they did. Then you kind of fast forward through the centuries and we're building churches. Maybe you fast forward even into the late 19th century in Mishawaka, where the first church on this site was over there, and then later this church. I don't know if you guys are aware of what the topography is, but we're all actually facing south. It was less important as time went on to be slavishly attached to the actual direction east. It was what really carried with it the greatest importance was the common direction of prayer, and a sense that even if we're facing south or we're facing west, that there would be a sense of a liturgical east. And so we build our churches then with a great emphasis on the sanctuary. There's always more light. I don't know if you noticed too, the financial report, the potential rendering that we may end up doing at some point if we decide to repaint the church in a decade or something like that. One of the really cool dynamics of that was the play on light. There would be gold, and there would be just a brightness and a splendor about that space over my left shoulder. Why? Because of the rising sun. Because of Jesus Christ, who is the dawn of new life. So friends, I just share that by way of saying, this isn't me as pastor trying to denigrate or to, in any way, shape, or form, say that something that has been embraced by most places, most of the time, is bad, and having sort of mass facing the people. We still have that. That's fine. And by the way, too, folks point to the Second Vatican Council as saying we need to do this. Actually, there's nothing about that in Vatican II. That seems to have been an outgrowth of some theological opinions that made their way into periodicals that became very popular. So it's an interesting dynamic too, but just to be aware of that. I'm not denigrating, though, that there is some potential value for that, but it was important to me to share, to share with those whom I love deeply, it's all of you, something of this ancient symbol of Christian worship is something to be received, not necessarily something to be universally liked, but something at least to be received, and something to maybe offer by way of a challenge for some, and that's fine. As I said, it's a challenge for me to get up in front of people. That's we're all trying to challenge ourselves, but to share that. And within the season of Advent in particular, then, to give expression to this fundamental, eager, zealous hastening toward the Lord together. That's the image. Running the race as one family together, running toward the Lord.